So hopefully this is working. I have no idea. I don't have any of my stuff with me today. For anybody who is watching this episode of the podcast, we are doing this remote. I am up in Alaska visiting my family, and so I'm sitting here outside on the porch because that's really the only place that I can find where there's not kiddos running around going nuts, or dogs. My parents have an absurd amount of dogs, which is awesome, but loud. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to have some of the backdrop in here. But my video editing skills are subpar, I think, at this point. So we're going to see if I can make it look cool for anybody. If the background is just completely blown out, which is what I think is going to happen, I will try to do my best. But there's a nice, pretty shot of the mountains right behind me, which is pretty cool. Don't get that usually in the Bookly podcast studio. So it's nice. For anybody who's listening on time, I think this episode comes out it's not May anymore. June 5th is when this episode will come out. If I can get this dang episode to upload in the middle of nowhere, Wi-Fi at my parents' house. But it's supposed to come out June 5th, and it is like a nice 65 degrees outside, sunny. So for anybody who's wondering what Alaska looks like in the summer, this is it. It's also, as you can see, still daytime, and it is almost 9 o'clock right now at night. And it'll look like this probably until almost 11, and then it'll start to get a little darker. So again, just a quick educational facts for anybody who has no idea what Alaska's like in the summer. It's pretty awesome. Growing up here was like the greatest thing in the world. And every year we try to make it back for as long as we can. So I think this year we're up here for a little over 3 weeks, just hanging out in Alaska. But I didn't want to let the podcast elapse here because I've got my schedule and I'm trying to stick to it as best I can. So we're just going to do our best. I did bring 2 mics up here, so maybe we can get somebody from Alaska who hasn't been a guest yet on the podcast. Maybe not. We'll see. But if not, you'll just get to listen to your regular scheduled podcast episodes. But if you're watching, you get to watch the regular podcast, but with a much prettier background than the office that we usually shoot in. So it's pretty awesome. This week's episode of the podcast is Mistborn, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. It's the first of the Mistborn trilogy, I think, or series. I don't know if it's a trilogy or a series, to be honest, and I'm rocking on this because this is a rocking chair on my parents' front porch. I'm hoping that the camera is picking that up and I'm still in focus the entire time. I'm sure that's driving viewers absolutely bonkers. I'll try to stay still. But no, this week's book was Mistborn, which I think it's like one of the first, or like it's definitely the first like true fantasy book that we've read. We've read some that might kind of dip into fantasy. We've read some science fiction. We've got Dune. We've got a couple of the other kind of space ones. We read the, what was that one about the multiple dimensions? I can't remember. They just made that TV show off of it. But yeah, we've read a couple science fiction books, but this might be the first episode of the Bookly podcast with a fantasy book. And I will say, just as some background, I've kind of always been like a closet fantasy nerd. As a kid, before I gave up reading for 15 years, I read the Aragon series, absolutely loved them. Not all of them. I think I read the first 3 or first 2. I can't remember. Yes, you can hear there are dogs everywhere. I also read the Harry Potter series, which is, again, fantasy. Loved Harry Potter as a kid. I've always loved Lord of the Rings and shows like that. I never read Lord of the Rings. I think The Hobbit's on this year's podcasting list, but I've never read it. So I've always kind of liked fantasy, but I haven't read any since starting the podcast because I was frankly just a little bit worried that I'd get sucked into it and not want to read all of the other boring books that are on my list of books to read this year. And I'm going to move away from reading classics to just binging fantasy books. And I will say that I've thought about it. I've thought about just throwing the whole podcast out the door and just binging fantasy books because that's how much I loved Mistborn. And it's not even that it was incredibly well written or that it was super impactful or that there was like this deeper meaning behind it. A lot of the books that we've read on the podcast so far, a lot of them are classics. A lot of them are self-help books or books that are highly recommended by like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and all of these other Lex Friedman and Bill Gates. Those are the kinds of books that we've read so far on the podcast. And this is as far from it as it gets, but I liked it honestly just as much. And I will say that it is funny because I have made fun of Olivia quite a bit recently for starting and really liking Agatar, or Court of Thorn and Roses, for those of you who have been living under a rock. But I feel like this is like the clean, more nerdy version of Agatar. Not that I've ever read Agatar, but I get why people really like those books. I get why people are obsessed with them. And it's because they're fun. And it's okay to have fun while reading. And that was my big lesson and my big takeaway from this book. And the reason why I liked it is because I just wanted to read it. Not because I was learning something or because I was becoming this phenomenal person or I was, I had this major life-changing experience while reading this book. But it's okay to read for fun. And books like this make reading for fun so much easier. And so anybody who's like struggling to read and read consistently, this would be a great palate cleanser because it is fun. Like if there's any word to describe this book, I would say fun. It was just good. It was just good from start to finish. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into this book for those of you who don't know and maybe convince a couple people to read this book because it was great. It was great. So let's read the summary of this book real quick. It is, for 1,000 years the ash fell and no flowers bloomed. For 1,000 years the sky slaved in misery and lived in fear. For 1,000 years the Lord Ruler, the sliver of infinity, reigned with absolute power and ultimate terror, divinely invincible. Then, when hope was so long lost that not even a memory remained, a terrible, scared, heartbroken half-ska rediscovered it in the depths of the Lord Ruler's most hellish prison. Kelsier snapped and found himself with the powers of a Mistborn. A brilliant thief, a natural leader, he turned his talents to the ultimate caper with the Lord Ruler himself as the mark. Kelsier recruited the underworld's elite, the smartest and most trustworthy Allomancers, each of whom shares one of his many powers, all of whom relish a high-stakes challenge. Then Kelsier reveals his ultimate dream, not just the greatest heist in history, but the downfall of the divine despot. But even with the best criminal crew ever assembled, Kel's plan looks more like the ultimate long shot until luck brings a ragged girl named Vin into his life. Like him, she's a half-ska orphan, but she's lived a much harsher life. Vin has learned to expect betrayal from everyone she meets. She will have to learn to trust Kel have to learn to trust if Kel is to help her master powers of which she never dreamed. So, it is, it's just that. It's a fantasy book. It's got magical powers. It's got a Lord Ruler. It's got a plot to overthrow the Lord Ruler. It's everything that you want in a fantasy story. And one of the criticisms that I've seen a lot about this book, and I've seen kind of online, and honestly, I was kind of thinking this before I read about it online, was that it is a pretty generic story. I was reading online on Reddit, and somebody said they made a, what's that called? It's called a Mad Lib, where you pick a word and it creates a story. They made a Mad Lib for fantasy stories, and it is, dear blank, fill in the blank, kid with weird name. I know you are only a blank, and it gives you options. Farmer, orphan, urchin, child of a minor noble, and it will be hard for you to accept this, but you have, quote, great powers. You are the chosen one. Insert name of funky power here. You are the only one who can, insert word, save the world, save the universe, defeat the empire, restore order to the force, kill the big boss. And it says, luckily, even though you just learned about your destiny 15 minutes ago, you will make up for this lost time by quickly becoming better than anyone in the history ever at, insert word here, Quidditch, dragon riding, sandworm riding, Allomancy, end quote. Any questions? And it is so true. Isn't that just like the story of most fantasy books? I mean, it really is. I think of, Star Wars. I think of this. I think of also Dune. I think there's a lot of fantasy and sci-fi stories that follow this trope. And I think because it's fun and we kind of all see ourselves as the underdog in a lot of situations. And so it's a story where we can maybe relate. It's a story where, you can find hope in it because maybe if you're not the best, or the greatest, there's like a path to becoming that way. And I think it's also a story just for people who might feel lost. Because I think most of those characters in this Mad Lib here, farmer, orphan, urchin, child of a minor noble, I mean, those are, downtrodden or lost individuals. And I feel like we all kind of feel like that at times. And so it's a more relatable character. I mean, how boring would a story be if it was like, dear, you've got like this nobleman who's like prince to the king, and he basically goes around and he becomes even more powerful than prince to the king. He becomes, lord ruler. Like, how unrelatable of a situation is that? And so I get why this is like a very kind of relatable trope and very predictable story. However, what I will say is that even though it's predictable, and from the get-go, I knew, what the purpose of each one of these characters were serving within the story, it never felt too predictable, if that makes sense. Like, the overall arching story felt predictable. You knew that they were going to overthrow the Lord Ruler. You knew that it was going to have to be, what was her name? I want to say Val, but it's not Val. Oh, it is. It's Vin. Sorry, Vin. You knew that Vin was going to have to be the one to do it. You knew that there was going to be some sort of tragedy with Kel. You had all these side characters, and you knew that Vin was going to end up being more powerful than a lot of the other people around them. She was going to learn quickly. It was all kind of like I said, the standard fantasy tropes. However, it was fun. And what's wrong with fun? Like, does every story have to be a complete new story? I don't think so. And I know that I often complain about Hollywood not making any new stories. And I think there's a difference between remaking a story completely and then taking the outlines for a great story and making it your own. And if we didn't do that, there would be no stories. Again, there are plenty of stories that have this same outline. And so you can't criticize them all. Everybody takes bits and pieces of stories and makes it their own. I mean, if you look at some of the greatest stories and greatest books ever written, I mean, one of the books that I've enjoyed the most was East of Eden, and it essentially just takes the story of the New Testament and retells it in a very new, creative, and fun way. You can look at books like this the same way. I mean, it takes the story of kind of your traditional hero and retells it. And I think that that's not a bad thing because it did it in a way that was new, refreshing, fun, created a whole world. The world building from Brandon Sanderson was incredible. I mean, I can't say enough about the world building. It was really fun, really, I don't want to say believable, but there weren't any like large plot holes in it. Sometimes powers are kind of, I don't know, overdeveloped, if you want to say, and it creates plot holes. So, I mean, again, this one didn't do any of that. So, very, very well constructed in there. So I don't know where I was going with that, but ultimately, yeah, not a new story, but a very familiar yet fun rendition of that story. Also, it was one of Brandon Sanderson's first books, I believe. I mean, he's crazy. So I do want to dive a little bit into Brandon Sanderson and kind of the cult following of Brandon Sanderson for this episode, because I have had so many people reach out to me and tell me that I need to read Brandon Sanderson books. And I've been putting it off for a little bit, mostly because, again, I don't want to get sucked down a rabbit hole where I have to read Brandon Sanderson now for the next month, even though I finished this book and then immediately put a hold on the next part of this trilogy on Libby. So I already have the next book on Libby, The Well to Ascension, I think is what it's called. And I will be reading that in my spare time between Bookly podcast books. So I already know that this series is going to suck my life away because it was that fun. But that being said, I put it off for a really long time. But everybody's a Brandon Sanderson fan. Like, people that I would never have guessed are Brandon Sanderson fans. Because to me, Brandon Sanderson is like the BYU, Brigham Young University Mormon author. And I thought he was just kind of like a Mormon guy, to be honest. Like, I thought there are authors that are just Mormon authors. You know, they're kind of like famous within the Mormon community, and, you know, everybody reads them because they're Mormon. And so they're like, oh, we should read his books and support him. And I always kind of thought Brandon Sanderson was that kind of author until I was watching some clip. I think it must have been on like Instagram Shorts or something like that, or Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, whatever it is. And they were talking to Henry Cavill, who's like for anybody who doesn't know, Henry Cavill, Superman, The Witcher, Man from U.N.C.L.E. He's in a bunch of different movies. He is like a mega nerd, like in the best way possible. Like, I don't mean that in like and obviously I don't mean that in like a derogatory way that dude could beat the crap out of me. He's yacked, but he's a pretty big nerd. I mean, like, loves Warhammer, loves, you know, kind of all of that kind of stuff. Super big into, you know, comic books and video games. He's very, very much a reason why the Witcher series stayed true to the books true to the video game as long as they did. Yeah, mega nerd. But he was asked in an interview, out of kind of with the exception of kind of like the big authors, you know, the Lord of the Rings, the C.S. Lewis, the whatever it is, who would you recommend reading, and who is his favorite author as far as world building goes when it comes to world building? And his answer was Brandon Sanderson. He said Brandon Sanderson is one of the best world builders and kind of, you know, creating a universe and creating rules and all that kind of stuff and interlocking stories from any other author that he reads, which is high praise from somebody who, you know, really, really is a part of that fantasy community. And so ever since then, I was like, well, maybe he's not just a Mormon author. And then I started doing a little bit of research about him. Man, has he sold a crap ton of books. So a little bit about Brandon Sanderson. He enrolled in Brigham Young University in 1994 as a biochemistry major, and his mom wanted him to be a doctor. So if my mother is listening to this podcast, know that I am not the only person who started off as a biochemistry major with their mom having hopes of them becoming a doctor to just throw it all away one day. That is exactly my life story for anybody who doesn't know, except I didn't go to Brigham Young University because that school is the absolute worst. I went to the University of Utah, and I was a bioengineering major, biochemistry major, with hopes and aspirations of becoming a doctor. A lot of because my mom kind of had hopes and aspirations to be a doctor, and I was interested in it. And I did I did quite a bit of like shadowing, and I did a mentorship program with the hospital in high school, and, you know, I was able to shadow doctors in OR rooms, seen a lot of different surgeries and stuff like that. And it did interest me, but it was funny because I just was learning about Brandon Sanderson, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. And after a year at BYU, he left BYU for 2 years to serve as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he spent 2 years in Seoul, Korea. And it was this time that he really started, he'd always liked writing and reading fantasy, but it was during this time that he'd decided that he wanted to kind of make that jump. And so after coming back from Korea, he decided to change his major to English, and just wrote as much as he could. And this is where I just love people who just chase their dreams. I think that's so awesome. I think there are so many people who settle for safe and comfortable in this world. And most people, I think, with time and effort will achieve their goals. I honestly believe that. I think most people in life are going to achieve your goals. And I think most people set their goals at safe and comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with safe and comfortable. I definitely have a goal to be safe and comfortable as well. But I think there are a lot of other people who set their goals so much higher than that, and a lot of people achieve it. And so I love hearing about people who throw that all away to chase what they truly love. And Brandon Sanderson's a great example of that. So he became an English major, and instead of just setting his goal at becoming a writer because he really liked writing, he went to work. And this is where when I was reading the story of Brandon Sanderson, I thought a lot about, what was that book we read back in, I think it was December, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And in Outliers, he talks about the 10,000 hour rule. He talks about it quite a bit in Outliers, how most people spend 10,000 hours to become a master at anything. And you can see by people who are successful that they've usually put in the time, and it's usually time that goes unrecognized in order to get to the point where they're successful. And so Brandon Sanderson, while he was in college, he took a job as a night desk clerk at a hotel because it allowed him to write while at work because nothing was going on. So he would just sit there at the front desk and he would just write books. And he was going to school full time during the day, and at nights he was working so that he could pay for his schooling, and he wrote as much as he could. He finished 7 books during his undergraduate degree. 7 books in a 4-year undergraduate degree. I know authors, professional authors, that don't finish 7 books in their entire career. I mean, this is somebody who really kind of embodies that outlier mentality of, I'm going to put in the work. I'm going to set the goal. I'm going to set the goal high, and I'm going to put in the work to get there. And I love stories like that. I live for stories. I eat stories like that up because, to be completely honest, I'm kind of hoping that this podcast eventually turns into one of those stories that, I'm putting in the work, I'm working hard, I'm doing podcast research, I'm reaching out to people, I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm continuing to do this podcast even when we only have a few hundred listeners every single week. And eventually I want to read books with interesting people. Like, how fun would this podcast be if sitting right next to me here in Alaska, we had like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who never would have read Mistborn before, but decided, hey, I'm going to read this book with Brandon for the Bookly podcast. And we get to hear what The Rock thinks about Mistborn. And we just have fun people on here reading books that are maybe out of their comfort zone a little bit. And we talk and we discuss them and we learn together. That's ultimately what I want this podcast to be. And we're putting in the hours right now. So I love hearing other people talk about, or I love reading about other people who put the work in and get there. So Brandon Sanderson, 7 books during his undergraduate degree. That is insane. And then if you think like, okay, well, he probably put 7 books out and then just, kind of coasted from there. And then those books were all crap. And, no, he just continued to write at that pace, and he still continues to write at that pace. So for some perspective, he currently has 80 books, according to him, I don't know if it's according to him. So I was trying to figure out on Reddit, or I was trying to figure out how many books Brandon Sanderson has published. And on Reddit, 5 months ago, there was a post saying that he hit 80. He hit his 80th book that he had published. But then there was another post that officially came out from him. I think it was in 2022. So 3 years ago, or maybe it had been 2000. No, it was 2024. No, 2022. I don't know. It was a couple years ago. No, it's 2024 now. So it's 2022. So it's 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he was sitting at 71 books that had been published by him. So that means that in the last 2 years, he's published 8 or at least 9 books. At least 9 books in the last 2 years. That's crazy. He is still pumping out books so fast. And also, these books aren't short. So Mistborn is on Audible. It's like 21 hours or something like that. I know The Way of Kings, which everybody absolutely loves. It's another one of his series. So for those of you who don't know, Mistborn is, he also kind of creates his own universe. So there are multiple kind of stories or storylines within the universe that he's created, and Mistborn is one of those series. And then there's also The Way of Kings, which is another one of those series. But I know The Way of Kings is like 1,000 pages. It's like 40 something hours on Audible. I mean, it's insane. So like, it's not like he's cranking out 20-page children's books. I mean, I think he does have some children's books, and I know he has kind of his Alcatraz versus the Librarians or something like that. He's got a young adult, or I don't think it's considered young adult. I think it's called teen, or, kids, moderate kids. Because I don't think it's like for 6-year-olds, but I don't think it's for, adults either. But he's got a series for that as well. So it's not all just 1,000-page books, but it's a lot of 1,000-page books too. Like, he cranks out large books at a consistent volume. And again, he's just putting more and more and more behind his books, because the more he writes, the better of a writer he's going to get. He's practicing. It's just like anything in life. The more and more you do something and you do it with a focused intent, he's going to get better at it. And so this book, Mistborn, The Final Empire, is one of his early books. He published this book in, I want to say 2000 and... I had it here. 2004, I think, is when he published this book. So if this book was published in 2004, he's created, multiple stories within this universe that he's created in this book. I mean, you're talking now 20 years of working on this universe from an author who's cranked out, let's just say 60 books about it since then. So that's all to say, Brandon Sanderson works ridiculously hard, and he treats writing like a full-time job. And it's so cool for somebody to do that, because like I was saying, I think there are a lot of authors who kind of, they get one really good book and they're okay with that. And maybe they'll write 3 or 4 other books and they don't quite hit the mark, but they're trying to replicate the success that they had with maybe their first book or their second book, instead of just trying to practice the art of writing enough so that they can continually pump out great books. And so a lot of respect for Brandon Sanderson. All that to say, if you become a Brandon Sanderson fan, good freaking luck keeping up with his writing pace. I've heard a lot of people who are like, oh, I love Brandon Sanderson, but I haven't read all of his books yet because he just writes them too fast. Like, he almost writes faster than people can read, which is crazy. Other cool Brandon Sanderson facts. So he has hit the New York Times. Oh my gosh. For anybody who doesn't know, the mosquitoes here in Alaska are big enough that they can carry away small children. And there's one just freaking attacking my ear. Oh my gosh. And as the sun goes down a little bit, and this is the sun going down a little bit for those of you who are like, no, it's still daytime. No, this is the sun going down right now. And as they go down a little bit, the mosquitoes come out even worse. They're freaking insane. No, some other fun facts though. He has hit the New York Times bestsellers list 15 times, and most recently with a number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list with Oathbringer, which is book 3 of the Stormlight Archive, which I think the Stormlight Archive is another one of his books in his universe. And it is also Audible's most pre-ordered book of all time. That's insane. So big record right there. Huge other big record here is that during COVID, Brandon Sanderson wrote 4 books in secret just for fun. He just wrote them for himself. I mean, maybe he was always planning to do this, but he wrote 4 books during COVID. And then in 2022, he wanted to self-publish those books instead of publishing them through Tor, which is his publishing outlet that he uses. He was going to self-publish those 4 books that he wrote during the pandemic. And so he decided to launch a Kickstarter trying to raise $1 million to help him self-publish those books. And in 3 days, so in 3 days, he had raised $20.3 million. And then in a month, he had raised $41.7 million, which at the time in 2022 was the most funded Kickstarter project ever. Let that sink in. He was an author, self-publishing books, and he had crushed the highest project funding on Kickstarter. Insane. Like, dude, this guy is just breaking records everywhere. So when I was originally thinking that this guy was just like some Mormon author that just the Mormons were, liking him, and that was the only reason why he was famous, I was wrong. No, this dude is beloved by a large swath of the fantasy kind of fan base. And it's because his books are fun. His books are super fun. One more interesting fact about Brandon Sanderson, and then we'll hop off the Brandon Sanderson train and we'll talk a little bit about the series. He's a professor at Brigham Young University, which is really cool that he takes the time to still teach while he's doing all this. I mean, honestly, I don't know how the guy lives because he also has a family. He's married, has kids. I honestly don't know when this dude sleeps or if he sleeps at all. I mean, maybe he doesn't. But he teaches at BYU, and I don't know if this is 100% true. So this is just maybe some lore behind the author of lore. So apparently to get into his class at BYU, obviously it's probably a very requested class. It's a high-level writing class. If you have any aspirations of being a writer, probably a pretty good person to network with. So I assume that there's a lot of people at BYU who really try to get into his class. But from my understanding, you have to write, I think, an entire book in order to get into his class. And you have to submit it as your proposal to be accepted into his class. And then he has like a TA or research assistants that read the books and then accept people into his class based on their book that they wrote in order to get into the class, which is crazy. I mean, that's some next level stuff for requirements to get into a college class. But I mean, it's kind of a next level professor too. So like, you want to surround yourself with like-minded individuals who are successful at what they're doing. I mean, you definitely want to surround yourself with somebody who is, debatably, well, sorry, my family also has honeybees. So that was just a massive bee flying by. But just welcome to Alaska. No, surround yourself with somebody who's, debatably one of the best-selling fantasy authors in the last, 30 years probably. I mean, he's crazy. He sells so many books. It's insane. And he's got, like I said, a cult-based following. So I thought that just some fun facts about Brandon Sanderson. If you don't know who he is, he's worth the Google. And, there's a reason why so many people love him, and it's because his books are great. This was one of his first books that was accepted and published. I want to say this was his first book that was published by his current publishing company. I know he had a couple books that were like picked up by individuals to publish, and then I think they like fell through, but I think this is the first book that was like published by a publishing company. And for it being your first book, I mean, dude, he kills it. So I loved this book. And like I said, I'm a sucker for a good fantasy book. I always have been. I just think the adventure in fantasy is fun, and it is an escape, and it, bends the laws of nature and of reality and the things that we are kind of bound by here on Earth, but at the same time does it in a way that kind of is relatable. You know what I mean? Like you still feel related to enough to the characters that you can put yourself in their shoes. You can be empathetic. You can be excited. You can, they can make you cry. They can make you feel all the feels. And that's why people love fantasy books. It's just, in my opinion, that's why people love fantasy books, because it's just enough magic to bring you out of reality, but just enough relatability to keep you in the story. And so I think that's why people love the Harry Potter books. That's why people love the Court of Thorn and Roses books. That's why people love those, what's the dragon one? Iron Flame and what's the Fourth Wing books. And that's why people love the Brandon Sanderson books. And so I know I make fun of A Court of Thorn and Roses, and I make fun of Iron Flame a lot. I had a couple people, we met up with a couple of my cousins this last week, and they were like, you really should read one of those books and do an episode on the podcast. And I'm throwing it around. So leave me a comment here in the YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, or leave a comment on the Instagram if you follow us on Instagram. Let me know if you think it would be fun for me to read one of those books, either A Court of Thorns and Roses or Fourth Wing, and I will do it because I want to know how it compares to Mistborn, because Mistborn has absolutely zero spiciness, is what we'll call it. It has absolutely zero spice in it. It is written, I want to reiterate this, it's written by a BYU professor, which means that there is zero spice in it. It is very, I mean, the violence I would say is pretty PG-13, and the rest of the book is very G-rated. I mean, language-wise, obviously, content-wise, it is all very G-rated except for the violence, which is a PG-13 level of violence, is what I would say. Definitely written by a BYU professor. So I'm very interested to see how that compares to some of these other stories, which my wife repeatedly tells me are not that spicy. But I don't know. I like to give her crap for it anyway, because that's what I do. So maybe with enough listener support, we'll bring one of those episodes on the podcast. Let me know what your thoughts are. That being said, I wanted to kind of go into some of the things that I absolutely loved about this book. The violence in this book. I know that's a little bit of a, I don't know. I don't know that there are probably a lot of people. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. There are a lot of people that love violence because it's a booming industry within Hollywood and everywhere. People love a good fight scene, but Brandon Sanderson is incredible at writing fight scenes. Like, it almost feels like you're reading an anime. Like the violence the fight scenes are so well choreographed and so well written that it's so easy to like imagine what's going on. I mean, up to the point of like the way characters are flying through the air, the powers that are being used. I do remember that, that was one of the things that I felt like was lacking in, Harry Potter. Harry Potter developed, one of the greatest worlds of all time. The Wizarding World is insane, right? The Wizarding World is crazy. Everybody on this planet wants to be in the Harry Potter world. Everybody wants to be everybody wants to be a wizard. And then on top of that, some of the greatest characters ever developed, I feel like, are in Harry Potter. I've said this on multiple podcast episodes. I think Dolores Umbridge is one of the best villains ever written in books. I'd put her as a top 10 villain ever written in a fiction book. And Harry, Hermione, all these characters, Dumbledore, Hagrid, they're just phenomenal characters. However, the fight scenes in Harry Potter are pretty blah. Like it's just a matter of spells being written and then you have colors and it's just not very descriptive. There's not a lot to them and it's not a major focal point of the book. Now, Mistborn, gee whiz, the fight scenes are incredible. Like if you like an anime fight scene, honestly, I felt like it was Attack on Titan level. Like I felt like I was reading an Attack on Titan manga in a completely different world with a completely different set of magical powers. And it was incredible. So if you like anime, you like that kind of fast-paced fight action scenes, it's incredible that Brandon Sanderson's able to write in a way that brings that to your mind. Like that was incredible. It was so fun. The final kind of battle with Kelsier is so good. Also with the Lord Emperor. There were so many scenes in this book that I was just like completely blown away with the way that Brandon Sanderson was able to write these scenes. And I can only imagine that it's going to continue to get better and better as he develops as an author. Not that he's not developed at this point in his career. He's at the point when he releases this book, I would have to imagine, and this is completely off the top of my head, but if he wrote 9 books or 7 books in his undergraduate degree, I would have to imagine that by the time he publishes this book, this is probably like book 15 for him. Maybe book 20 at this point that he's written. And so he's had a lot of practice. He's good at writing. He's very good at writing fight scenes, even in this book. But I could imagine it only gets better. And so I'm excited to read the next couple books of the series because it was really cool. The other thing that I absolutely loved about this book was the magic. Now, I know that there were a lot of people that didn't love the limited vocabulary within the magic. That was some of the negative comments on Goodreads for him are essentially that he has a very small vocabulary when he writes. He's not Steinbeck, you know what I mean? Like, he's not very overtly descriptive. He doesn't, use a large swath of the dictionary when he writes. He uses the same words pretty repetitively, and he has a very small batch of words that he uses in order to write his story. His story is very developed. His characters in this book are is what I would call moderately developed. They're not overly developed characters, but they're moderately developed. And his, the overall world is very well developed, but the language, I would say, is not very developed. And so the magic becomes pretty repetitive. I know that they use the word burned a lot. I mean, because the magic in this book, essentially you burn different types of metals to release different powers. And so there was not a thesaurus that was very well utilized during this book when coming to the application of powers. Essentially, you either burned them or there was one other word. He used two words. It was burned or I can't remember what the other word is. But there are two words that he uses in order to initiate your magical powers. And I felt like a thesaurus might have been useful in that regard because that did get a little bit repetitive. So that criticism I would agree with. But again, this is somebody who is more interested in fantasy than writing, I think. And so I think that comes across a little bit within this book. But when writing a set of magical powers, Brandon Sanderson, because obviously he's a teacher, so he's not only a great writer, but he's also a teacher. So he has 3 laws of magic that are creative guidelines that we use to create magical systems for fantasy stories. And he tries to follow this in all of his books. And I thought that was really cool because, I don't know, I'm a very mathematical or logical person. And so I like the ideas of creating laws and rules, especially when you're breaking laws and rules, because it makes things more orderly. And I don't know, I think when I think of mathematics, I just think of order in the world. And so if you're going to be taking away order, I mean, obviously when you add the element of magical powers, you're removing some order within the world that we live in. The order of gravity, the order of, spontaneous corruption, or I don't know, spontaneous implosion or whatever it is you're doing. I mean, there's order within the world that you're removing in order to bring in magic into the system. So I think it's also equally important that you add rules and order to your magic in order to not get carried away or create, plot holes or, large gaps in believability. I think that was one of my biggest things when reading. I can't remember what the book's called. It's going to come back to me. And I know I referenced it already once in this book, but it was that book by Blake Crouch about the multiple dimensions that we read. It was I think it was like 2 months ago. We read it on the podcast. But yeah, it was by Blake Crouch. And ultimately, when talking with Josh on the podcast about that book, my biggest complaint was the plot holes within the book. Like, there was this new scientific, science fiction element of the book that was introduced, but there weren't rules behind it. There wasn't a set of laws and rules that Blake Crouch created alongside of this new thing that in the end created almost more chaos than it brought to the story. And that was my biggest complaint about the story. I felt like there were so many plot holes. I felt like there were, just, I don't know, things that made sense and things that didn't make sense based on the world that was created in that book. And I think a lot of that can be avoided by creating parameters for your new world. And so I love that Brandon Sanderson does this. And so I want to go through and read some of these parameters because I think it's really, really neat. And especially for anybody who's kind of like thinking about books or thinking about becoming an author or just likes stories or likes to analyze stories. I mean, I just think, knowing this is kind of fun because you can maybe peel back and look at, how some of your favorite authors, maybe Tolkien or, what's his R.R. Martin or whatever, whoever wrote Game of Thrones or, Sarah J. Maas or whoever it is that you really, really like. You can kind of go back and see, if this was something that they adhered to unknowingly, even though maybe they had never read these rules by Brandon Sanderson, and he just the first person to kind of put that to paper. So the first rule is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. Super, super cool. And I also think that this is phenomenally well done by J.K. Rowling. The magic, I think one of the things that makes Harry Potter so magical is that the magic is so simple and everybody can visualize it and understand it. And so the world unfolds so easily to the reader. And that's why it's so relatable, and that's why it's so amazing. And in the flip side of this, I think that is why so many people hate Dune. And that's why I personally hated Dune, because I know that it's not necessarily magic, but I still have no idea how or what the heck spice is, what it does, how it affects some people differently than others, why some people can fold space and time with like the Spacing Guild, why the Bene Gesserit can see in the past, and why somehow Paul Atreides can see in the past and the future, what that has to do with spice, any of the stuff that goes on in Dune. I have no clue any of it. Now, the movie is visually incredible, and so it kind of makes up for the crappy book that it was made to follow. But ultimately, that is my biggest gripe with Dune. And I know that that's a big gripe for a lot of people with Dune. And so, again, I love that kind of contrast. And the magic in this book is very simple in Mistborn. There are, 12 elemental metals. Each one has a specific power. Some people can use one of them, and there are some people in Mistborn who can use all 12 of them. And there are only 12 different things that can be done through these metals. It makes it very simple, easy to understand, and makes for a great magical system in the world that you created. Again, I just love that. I think that's a good rule to be adhered to. The second rule: weaknesses, limits, and costs are more interesting than powers. Oof, I love that rule. Weaknesses, limits, and costs are more interesting than powers. Yeah, I again 100% wholeheartedly agree with that rule. I think that people relate more to weakness than they do to power. I think because most people see their shortcomings more than they see their inherent abilities. And so being able to relate to weaknesses and relate to powers gives not only the protagonist or the antagonist the opportunity to overcome those powers and weaknesses and be creative, but it also allows the reader to become to relate more to the story. Provides for important character arcs. I do think that this is great because, again, this shows like Superman. Superman is kind of a boring superhero, right? I mean, how many people, when you ask them who your favorite superhero is, say Superman? I would be willing to bet almost no one. I knew one person in my life, and I think he just said that. And if Wade, if you ever listen to this podcast, know that I'm talking about you. But I think he's the only person that I know who, if you ask them who their favorite superhero was, he'd say Superman, and he only did it because he wanted to make people angry. Because nobody likes Superman as their favorite superhero. Everybody likes the characters that have weaknesses. Everybody likes the characters who have flaws and who've overcome them. People who have to be creative with their powers. It creates for just a more interesting and well-rounded character, and somebody who's, again, a little bit more relatable. So I love that. Third rule is the author should expand on what is already part of the magic system before something entirely new is added, as this may otherwise entirely change how the magic system fits into the fictional world. I'm trying to think of a good example for this, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, try not to continually add to your story. Instead, try to expound upon what you currently have. I think that's, I think that's really, really, really important. I mean, I don't know if I can off the cuff here in the middle of the podcast think of somebody who's maybe done that well or done that poorly. But if it comes to me, I'll let you know. But I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense. You don't want to add too much more. Instead, try to expound upon what you have and maybe find the weaknesses in the story that you've already created. Anything that becomes overly complex, it's just, I don't know, it becomes boring. Again, you want to simplicity. I think that there's magic in simplicity. So I think that's awesome. Again, I'm just going back to Harry Potter because Harry Potter expands upon magic so well, and it doesn't. I mean, there's magical creatures and there's other things. I mean, maybe that's the part where I would say, I don't know, maybe not. No, I mean, Harry Potter's perfect. You can't hate on Harry Potter. Then he says that there's also one extra bonus law. He calls it the zeroth law. And this is kind of like just a word to the wise when creating your magic systems. And it says, always err on the side of what's awesome. And I love that that's the caveat, because I think sometimes, again, I think rules are great. Rules are amazing. And it's important to have them, because if you don't have the rules going into things, you're going to find yourself maybe in a tough situation later on in your book or your series or whatever it is. I'll finish up this thought. But however, when in doubt, just write a freaking good story. Write an awesome superpower. Write an amazing fight scene. Write something incredible, and it doesn't even matter. So just make it awesome. I love that. But I just thought of something for that third rule, that authors should expand on what's already a part of the magic system before entirely adding something new. The current Marvel universe is this exactly. They have taken something that was originally created, awesome, incredible. They could have kept running with it, and I mean, almost indefinitely. They didn't really need to do anything to it. And then they, instead of just continuing to expand on what they had, they just brought in a bunch of new crap, and it ruins the story. Again, it ruins it instead of just continuing to hyper develop what you already have. In my opinion, that is a good example. Maybe some people don't agree with me, but I think that that's a pretty spot on example for everything that Brandon Sanderson said. So I think, I mean, he definitely stuck to this when writing this book. I don't want to give too much away about this book, but it's awesome. And if you are struggling to read at all, maybe you were somebody who liked to read when you were, a kid, and then maybe, throughout middle school and high school, your teachers tried to get you to read a bunch of garbage books that you can't relate to, because I really don't think that high schoolers and middle schoolers should be reading books like Animal Farm and, Grapes of Wrath and all these books. I do think these are important books, and I'm loving reading them now in my, late 20s, early 30s. However, I think it takes a little bit more of an understanding of the world, a little bit more of an understanding of yourself to expect a 14-year-old to understand the complexities of authoritarian communism in Russia in order to read a book about animals and farms, and to expect kids to understand, the kind of the selfish desires of men, and, the chaos that's created through, a kind of destroyed society. I think it's just crazy. I don't know. That's my rant about the books that people require kids to read, because ultimately, like, middle schoolers and high schoolers, you're kids. I mean, they're kids, right? You're less than 18 years old. They don't have the life experience to read these books. Instead, you should be fostering a love for reading, a love for learning. And maybe if you've lost that because teachers tried to get you to read boring books in high school and in middle school, try reading a book like this. Try to read a fantasy book that's just fun, entertaining, relatable, just overall awesome, and see if it kicks you back into a reading kind of mindset, because this is the kind of book that, had I not made it a goal, would have kicked me back into reading. Like, I was way out of the reading world for a long time. Again, I went 15 years without reading a single book. And it had a lot to do with the books that I was assigned to read, my interest level, my educational level, my just overall maturity level. I just wasn't at a place where reading to me meant anything. But a book like this would have at least kept me reading, would have kept me in that world, shown me some fun stories, and maybe fostered a love for learning that would have expanded into other books. And so if that's you, then definitely pick up this book and read. If you just want a fun book, maybe a palate cleanser book, maybe you've spent so much time reading self-help, entrepreneur, bro science books that you're just like, man, I just need a fun book. This is it. Read a Brandon Sanderson books. They're awesome. They're a great escape. I am already started the second one, even though I need to read next week's book for the podcast, which is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but I just really want to read The Well to Ascension. So we'll see. I'm going to get both done, but it's a struggle now that I'm a Brandon Sanderson fanboy. So you can definitely, that's what Olivia keeps calling me. Olivia keeps calling me a fanboy, but she's an Agatar and a Fourth Wing fangirl. So I'm okay being a Brandon Sanderson fanboy. I guess it runs in the family. But overall, I would give this book a 5 for engaging. Just so fun, so engaging. That's exactly what this book should have been. And I would say a 2 for importance. I don't think it's a 1, because I think that the ability to create worlds, the worlds that it creates, I think the ability to kind of pull people out of reality and give them a break, I think that is an important thing. I don't think that taking breaks and, palate cleanser books are non-important books. And I don't think that you should ever view them as like something that you can't learn from or that can't better your life. I mean, maybe an escape from reality can be exactly what you need at this phase in your life. Maybe you're way too hyper-focused on being, a bazillionaire, that you just need a break from, all the David Goggins and Jocko Willink that you read. And this could be exactly what you need to just kind of reset your life and get to a point where, things are fun again. Then, hey, this book's super important to you. Now, do I think that this book's going to, change your life and teach you 12 rules to, organize chaos in your life? Absolutely not. But it doesn't have to be. Not every book has to be. I'm trying to teach myself that as well. I kind of set off doing this podcast trying to become a better person through reading. And I think sometimes becoming a better person just means enjoying the journey as well. And so enjoy the books that you read as well. Don't only focus on books that are educational or books that are, classics or are going to make you smarter or whatever. Also pick books that are going to be fun. And if those books are fun for you, then that's awesome. But honestly, fantasy books are kind of fun for me. And I think they're fun for a large group of, or a large population of the world, because it's an escape, and it's an escape from the grind, and that's okay. That is okay. So overall, I'd give it a 5 for engaging and a 2 for importance. And I would highly, highly recommend it. I'm going to keep cranking through these books, and maybe we'll have a guest on the podcast for the next one. I have quite a few friends who love Brandon Sanderson, so we'll see what we can do there. But next week's book is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I will still be in Alaska. I'm going to be in Alaska here for the next 1, 2, 3 episodes, I think. Maybe 4, because I think I'm going to have to record the next one before we leave. So I think 4 episodes I'm going to be here in Alaska. So maybe we'll get creative with places that we record these, record them in some fun places, or maybe we'll just do them all on my parents' front porch, because it's absolutely gorgeous here. I'm hoping that you can see how pretty it is in the video here, but it is amazing. So glad to be home. If anybody in Alaska listens to the podcast, definitely hit me up if you want to hop on an episode. I think we've got A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Catch 22, and I think there's one more, or another book after that. So I think those will be the 4 books. This book will come out, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Catch 22, and one more book will come out while we are here in Alaska. So let me know if you want to be on the podcast. If you want to see the complete list of books for the rest of the year, that is on both our Instagram, and that is Bookly Podcast Instagram, or it is on our YouTube page. If you go to the community sections of our YouTube page, there are 2 posts there with the 2024 reading list. So make sure to check that out and read along with the podcast. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Bookly Podcast. If you are on YouTube, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. And if you are on Apple or Spotify or wherever podcasts are listened to, make sure that you leave us a 5-star review and tune in next week. Like I said, for Tree Grows in Bookland. Honestly, I have no clue what that book is about. I need to start it, but I'm pretty sure there's a tree, and I think it takes place in New York. That's all I know about that book. I didn't even know it was technically considered a classic. I just know that a lot of people talked about it, so I put it on my reading list. That's how dumb I am. But I'm excited to read it. I hope I like it. We'll see. Thanks for listening. See you next week.